At family dinner, my son-in-law looked across the table and sneered that my wife was gone, and I should check into a nursing home that very night, as if I were nothing more than a burden they were ready to discard. My daughter sat beside him and did not defend me. She only nodded quietly, as if agreeing was easier than truth. The air in the room changed before I even spoke, heavy and cold, like the house itself had decided I no longer belonged there. My grandson froze mid-motion, staring at his phone with a pale face that did not match the laughter just moments before. Then he whispered something that made the entire table shift in silence. My name was on Forbes, and they were calling me a billionaire. No one laughed after that. No one even breathed the same way. And I remember thinking, not about anger, but about how quickly a family can decide who you are without ever asking who you have become. If this story speaks to your heart, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And tell me where you are watching from in the world and what time it is in your city right now, because sometimes stories like this feel less lonely when we know we are not listening alone. My name is Blaine Whitmore. I am 72 years old, and what happened that night was not just a dinner. It was the moment my own family tried to erase me while sitting right across from me. And I want you to stay with me until the end, because what you think you understand about that night is not even close to the truth. And now let me take you back to how it all began. The house in Fairfax, Virginia, had always felt too large since Margaret passed, as if every room had forgotten how to hold a family together, and Jason, my son-in-law, had a way of filling that silence with certainty, the kind of certainty that leaves no space for disagreement. He sat at the head of the table that evening like it belonged to him, tapping his fingers lightly against the wood while speaking about decisions I was apparently no longer qualified to make. Emily, my daughter, avoided my eyes as she passed the roasted chicken, her movements careful, rehearsed, as if she had learned how to survive these dinners by staying small inside them. I remember Jason leaning back in his chair, smiling without warmth, and saying I was no longer stable enough to manage my own affairs, that I needed proper placement, care, supervision, words that sounded polite but landed like a verdict. I did not respond at first, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned over the years that silence often reveals more than argument ever could. Noah, my grandson, sat across from me scrolling his phone, pretending not to listen, until something on the screen pulled him out of the room entirely, his expression shifting in a way I had never seen before. "Grandpa," he said slowly, his voice uncertain, "this can't be real." Jason sighed as if annoyed by interruptions, but Noah pushed the phone forward with shaking hands, showing an article headline that carried my name in a way I had not seen spoken aloud in years, tied to numbers, companies, and words like legacy and fortune. For a moment, no one moved, not even Jason, whose confidence seemed to hesitate for the first time that evening, like a man realizing the floor beneath him was not as solid as he believed. Emily finally looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing a stranger sitting in the chair where her father used to be. But what none of them understood, what none of them had ever bothered to ask, was that silence is not emptiness, and a quiet man is not always a powerless one. Years before that dinner, long before anyone in that room decided I was finished, I had already built a life they never saw, not because I hid it from them, but because they never thought to look beyond what they wanted to believe. And as I sat there watching the meaning of my life shift across their faces like a storm arriving too late to prepare for it, I realized something simple and final. The truth had already been written long before that night, and someone in that room had just finally read the first line. I remember the exact moment silence stopped being peace in my life and started becoming distance, not the dramatic kind people imagine, but the slow kind that builds over years until you only notice it when you are already standing alone inside it. And as I sat at that table in Fairfax, watching my grandson's words still hanging in the air like something no one knew how to touch, my mind drifted backward without permission, not to one single event, but to a pattern that had been forming long before anyone in that room decided who I was allowed to be. Margaret used to say that families do not break in one place. They leak, quietly, like water through a foundation, and I did not understand what she meant until after she was gone. There was a time when Emily would call me just to ask how the day felt, not what I was doing, not what I had achieved, just how it felt to be alive on a Tuesday in October when the air in Virginia starts to turn sharp. And I can still hear her voice from those years, lighter, unguarded, before life taught her to measure every sentence. Jason was not always the man who sat at my table speaking like he had already replaced me. There was a time when he asked me questions about my work, about investments, about decisions, and I answered him carefully, not because I distrusted him then, but because I had learned long before that information is never just information, it becomes leverage in the wrong hands. After Margaret passed away, the house changed first, not physically, but in the way a house changes when the person who softened it is no longer there. And I remember standing in the kitchen one morning realizing that the sound of her coffee cup had disappeared from the world entirely. Emily moved closer to Jason after that, not all at once, but in small adjustments I pretended not to see, the way she would pause before answering me when he was in the room, or how she would explain my words to him after I had already spoken them, as if translation had become necessary between father and daughter. I once asked her, gently, if everything was all right, and she smiled in that careful way she had learned and said, "We are just trying to get everything organized, Dad." And I nodded as if organization was the same thing as distance. There were meetings I was not invited to, financial reviews I only heard about after decisions had already been made, and trust documents that began appearing with language so clean and precise that it left no room for a man like me, only for versions of me that could be managed. I remember Jason once telling me, over coffee that had gone cold between us, that modern families needed structure, that emotions could not be allowed to interfere with long-term planning, and I remember thinking how easily people use the word planning when what they really mean is control. Emily would sometimes call me late in the evening, her voice lower, careful, as if she were speaking from inside a room she did not want anyone else to hear, asking me to clarify things Jason had already explained to her. And I would answer her questions, but I could hear something else beneath them. Not confusion, but hesitation, the kind that grows when someone is slowly learning not to trust their own memory. There were moments I almost intervened, moments when I could have drawn lines in conversations that were already bending in the wrong direction, but grief has a strange way of making even strong men patient in ways they should not be. And after Margaret died, I mistook patience for wisdom. I started spending more time alone, not because I wanted to, but because it became easier than explaining myself into rooms where I no longer felt fully present. And in that quiet, I began noticing things I had previously ignored, small financial statements arriving with unfamiliar formatting, accounts that had been renamed, decisions that carried my name in theory but not in intention. I asked questions, and the answers were always calm, always prepared, always just reasonable enough to make me feel like the problem was my timing rather than their actions. Emily once said to me, "Jason is only trying to protect us," and I remember looking at her and realizing she truly believed that protection and restriction could feel the same if you stayed inside it long enough. I did not argue, because arguments require two people standing on equal ground, and I was beginning to suspect the ground beneath me had already been shifted without my consent. Even Noah, when he was younger, would look at me differently during visits, not with disrespect, but with curiosity, like someone trying to understand a story that had been summarized too many times by other voices. And now, sitting there years later, I understood something I had refused to see at the time, that what I had experienced was not a single betrayal, but a gradual rewriting, a quiet reassignment of identity inside my own family, where I was still physically present but increasingly defined by people who had stopped asking me to define myself. The truth about that night at the table was not that it began there. It was that it finally became visible there, like a photograph slowly developing after too much time in the dark. And as I looked across at Emily and Jason, I realized they were not reacting to a sudden revelation. They were reacting to a history they had been shaping for years without realizing it would one day look back at them. And what none of them could yet see, not even Noah with his phone still in his hand, was that the past they thought they understood was already preparing to answer them in a language they had never bothered to learn. The moment Jason decided to stop treating me like a person and start treating me like a problem was not loud or dramatic. It was almost casual, like a man adjusting a chair that he believed was in his way, and I remember it clearly because nothing about his tone changed when he said it, even though everything in the room did. We were in the same house in Fairfax, Virginia, early afternoon light coming through the tall windows, the kind of light that makes everything look harmless even when it is not, and Jason was standing near the kitchen counter flipping through documents that did not belong to him in the way he handled them. "We need to consolidate things," he said without looking up, as if speaking about groceries or utility bills, not the structure of a man's entire life. Emily was beside him, quiet again, her hands folded in front of her like she was trying to take up less space in her own home, and Noah was upstairs, the house unusually still except for the sound of paper turning. I asked him, calmly, what exactly he meant by consolidate, and Jason finally looked at me, not with anger, but with the confidence of someone who believed the conversation was already settled. Power of attorney, medical oversight, financial access, he said, ticking each phrase like he was reading instructions from a manual, and then he added, almost gently, you have been managing things alone for too long. That word, alone, landed differently than he intended, because I had not been alone. Not in the way he thought. I had simply stopped explaining myself to people who were no longer listening. Emily spoke then, softly, Dad, it is just temporary. Jason thinks it will make things easier. And I remember looking at her, not with anger, but with the quiet recognition that she had begun repeating sentences that were not originally hers. Jason placed a folder on the table and slid it toward me, his finger resting on the signature line as if guiding me through something simple, and he said, we already spoke to legal counsel in Arlington. This is standard procedure for someone your age. My age. He said it like a classification, not a fact, and I could feel something shift in the air between us. Not rage, not fear, but distance, the kind that forms when people stop seeing you as the author of your own decisions. I did not sign anything. I simply closed the folder and asked him when exactly he had decided I was no longer capable of making my own choices, and Jason smiled faintly, the kind of smile that is not meant to be kind, and said, it is not personal, it is responsibility. That was the first time I realized how easily responsibility becomes a word people use when they want to take something without calling it taking. Later that evening, I found missing statements from my study, not stolen in a violent sense, but removed with intention, folders rearranged, documents relocated, small absences that only someone who knew their own patterns would notice, and when I asked Emily about them, she hesitated too long before answering. Jason is just trying to keep everything organized, she said again, and I remember replying quietly, organized for who? But she did not answer. The following morning, Jason made another move, more direct this time, informing me that certain accounts had been reviewed and that adjustments had already been made for efficiency, and when I pressed him, he said, you are still receiving your personal allowance, nothing has changed in your daily life. Allowance? He used that word as if I were a dependent rather than the man whose name had built half the structure they were now standing inside. That was when I asked for the one thing I had not asked for in years, access to the original trust documentation created with Margaret, and for the first time Jason's composure slipped just slightly. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough for me to recognize the shift. That is being handled through probate review, he said quickly, too quickly, and Emily looked away at that exact moment. And I knew without being told that something had already been set in motion without my approval. Noah came downstairs while we were speaking, holding his phone in a way that suggested he had been reading for some time. And he did not sit down immediately. He just stood there watching the room like he was trying to understand a language everyone else was pretending was simple. Mom, he said quietly, this does not feel right. And Jason immediately turned to him, sharper now, saying, this is adult business, Noah. But Noah did not move. Instead, he walked closer to the table and placed his phone down, screen still lit, and I saw a name on it that I had not seen spoken aloud in years. Not in that house, not in that context. A financial entity tied to accounts I had once quietly managed through channels no one in that room had ever bothered to learn about. Jason reached for the phone, but Noah pulled it back first time in his life with certainty and said, I think Grandpa should see this. I did not touch it immediately, because I already knew what I was going to see before I saw it, not the full truth, not yet, but the edge of something that had been buried under years of assumptions. When I finally looked, I saw references to holdings, advisory structures, and legacy investment positions that carried my name in places I had never been expected to be visible, and I could feel Jason watching me carefully now, not confident anymore, but calculating. Emily finally spoke my name, softly, like she was trying to reconnect to a version of me she had stopped visiting, and said, Dad, what is this? But I did not answer her right away, because in that moment I realized Jason had not just crossed a line of respect or authority, he had touched something he did not understand at all, something that had never been dormant, only invisible to people who assumed silence meant absence. And as I looked at the screen again, I understood that what he thought he was controlling was only the surface, and beneath it, something far larger had already begun to wake. I remember the exact moment the atmosphere in that house changed again, not because someone raised their voice, but because someone new entered the space carrying a kind of authority that did not need explanation. And in a room like that, authority always feels like a temperature drop before anyone understands why. The front door was still open from Noah stepping outside moments earlier, and I was still looking at the screen in his hand when I heard a voice I had not heard in years, calm, precise, and unmistakably trained to take control of a room without asking permission. Blaine Whitmore, the voice said, not as a question, but as confirmation, and I turned slowly because there are only a few tones in life that make a man stop thinking about everything else at once. Standing in the entryway was a man in his late 60s, wearing a dark jacket that looked simple at first glance but carried the quiet structure of someone who had spent his life in rooms where decisions mattered more than conversation. His posture was straight in a way that was not learned in comfort, and his eyes were fixed on me with recognition that did not belong to the present moment, but to another life entirely. Jason was the first to speak, trying to reclaim the room, asking who he was and why he was in a private residence. But the man did not look at him immediately. Instead, he stepped forward slightly and said again, Blaine Whitmore. This time softer, as if testing whether time had broken memory. I stood up slowly, not because I felt threatened, but because something inside me had shifted into recognition long before logic caught up, and I said his name in return, Colonel Harris, and the room went quiet in a way that felt different from before, heavier, more permanent. Emily looked between us, confused, and Jason let out a short laugh, saying, Do you know this man? As if the idea itself was inconvenient, but Colonel Harris did not respond to Jason at all, his attention fully on me now. I heard your name in Arlington last week, he said, taking one step further into the room, and I did not believe it at first, and there was something in his voice that carried both disbelief and respect, the kind of tone people use when they realize history has walked back into their present without warning. Noah moved slightly closer to me without realizing it, still holding his phone, watching the exchange like someone trying to decide which version of reality was correct. Jason finally interrupted again, more firmly, saying, This is a family matter. But Colonel Harris finally turned his head toward him, and the expression on his face changed just enough to make Jason stop speaking mid-sentence. I have worked with men who built systems that decide the difference between ownership and dependency, Harris said quietly, and I recognize when someone is standing on something they do not understand. Emily whispered my name again, but this time it sounded uncertain, and I could feel the weight of all the years in that sound. Not anger, but confusion finally reaching its limit. Colonel Harris stepped closer to the table and placed a folded document down, not dramatically, not forcefully, but with the certainty of someone who does not need to prove authenticity. Jason glanced at it without touching it, but I could see the shift in his eyes when he recognized the formatting, the seals, the structure of financial and legal language that does not appear in casual disputes. You have been trying to restructure assets tied to Whitmore Legacy Holdings, Harris said, now addressing Jason directly, without understanding the original trust architecture. Jason straightened immediately, defensive now, saying, Those assets are under proper management, but Harris shook his head slightly, as if correcting a misunderstanding that had already caused too much damage. Proper management does not override founder designation, he said, and the word founder landed in the room like something unfamiliar but undeniable. Emily looked at me again, this time differently, not as a daughter judging a father, but as someone realizing she had been standing in a building without knowing who designed it. Noah finally spoke, quietly, asking Colonel Harris if he knew what was on the phone, and Harris looked at him for the first time with something almost like approval, saying, If that is what I think it is, then your grandfather is already in more control than anyone in this room realizes. Jason took a step forward, his voice sharper now, demanding explanation, but Harris lifted a hand slightly, not in aggression, but in control, and said, You were speaking about accounts that were never meant to be visible to short-term management structures. The silence that followed was different from earlier silences, because this one had direction, as if the room itself was waiting for confirmation of something it already suspected. I finally spoke, asking Colonel Harris how long he had known, and he hesitated for the first time since arriving, then said, long enough to know that someone has been underestimating you for years. Jason let out a breath that sounded less like confidence and more like pressure escaping a sealed container, and Emily placed her hand on the edge of the table as if she needed something physical to stabilize herself. And in that moment, watching all of them recalibrate the version of me they thought they understood, I realized Colonel Harris had not come to introduce new information. He had come because the information already existed, and someone outside this house had finally confirmed what my own family had refused to see, that the foundation they believed they were standing on was not something they had built. And as Harris looked at me one more time and said quietly, "They have been operating under a false assumption," I understood that the next truth about to surface would not come gently, and that everything in that room had already begun to tilt toward a reality none of them were prepared to face. Colonel Harris did not move from where he stood near the table, but the air around him had changed, as if his presence had quietly reorganized the room into something more structured than family conflict, something closer to a record being corrected in real time. And I remember how Jason tried to reclaim control with words that sounded stronger than he felt. "You are making this sound like something it is not," Jason said, forcing a small laugh, but it came out thin, almost rehearsed. And Harris simply looked at him the way men look at someone who has only seen the surface of a system they believe they understand. "It is exactly what it is," Harris replied calmly, and then he turned slightly toward me, as if deciding how much of the truth could safely exist in a room like this. Emily was still standing near the counter, her hand resting on the edge as if she needed something solid to anchor her thoughts, and Noah had not sat down since showing the phone, his attention locked on every movement like he was afraid the truth might disappear if he blinked. Harris finally opened the folder he had placed earlier, sliding out documents that looked ordinary at first glance, until the language inside began to settle into meaning. And I saw Noah lean forward slightly, reading without fully understanding yet still sensing importance. "Whitmore Capital Advisory Network," Harris said quietly, and the way he spoke those words suggested they were not new information, but confirmation of something long observed. "Structured asset coordination, private equity channels, and offshore investment alignment dating back more than 2 decades. Jason frowned immediately, cutting in, saying, "That has nothing to do with him." But Harris did not acknowledge the interruption, continuing as if Jason's voice belonged to a different conversation entirely. "Your father was not the operator," Harris said, looking directly at Emily now. "He was one of the original architects behind the advisory framework that allowed multiple entities to function without centralized exposure." The word architect shifted something in Emily's expression, not understanding yet, but beginning to feel the weight of language she had never heard applied to me before. I remained silent, not because I did not recognize what he was referencing, but because hearing it spoken aloud inside my own home felt like watching a locked room finally being opened in front of people who had spent years insisting it was empty. Noah spoke softly, almost to himself, asking what advisory framework meant, and Harris nodded slightly toward him as if acknowledging that he was the only one in the room asking the correct question. "It means," Harris said, "that your grandfather did not simply invest money, he structured the environments in which capital moved. Quietly, indirectly, and often under names that were never meant to be publicly connected." Jason stepped closer now, his voice tightening, saying, "That is not possible. He has been retired for years. He lives here. He is not running anything." And for the first time, Harris showed something close to restraint frustration, not anger, but disappointment in how incomplete the understanding was. "Retirement is not the same as disengagement," he said, and then he added something that caused Emily to finally look directly at me again, fully, without avoidance. "Some positions are not active roles. They are residual authority structures." The room went quiet after that, not the earlier silence of shock, but a heavier one, the kind that forms when people realize they may have been speaking inside assumptions rather than facts. Noah looked down at his phone again, scrolling now with urgency, and I could see fragments of articles, archived financial references, and names of institutions that I had not heard spoken aloud in years. Not because they were hidden, but because they existed in spaces most people never think to search. Emily finally asked me, her voice smaller than before, "Dad, why did we not know any of this?" And I could hear something underneath her question that was not accusation, but regret forming before understanding arrived. I did not answer immediately, because the answer was not simple. And because simplicity was what had allowed this misunderstanding to exist for so long. Jason tried again, softer this time, as if recalibrating, asking Harris what exactly he was implying, and Harris closed the folder slowly before speaking. "I am implying nothing," he said. "I am confirming what already exists in verified financial history." Then he looked at me again, and there was a pause in his voice that felt personal, not professional. He was not publicly visible in most of these structures because visibility was never the purpose of his role. Noah suddenly stopped scrolling, his eyes fixed on one line, and he turned the phone slightly so Emily could see, and I watched her expression change as she read, not disbelief now, but confusion mixed with something like dawning recognition. The article was not recent, not sensational, not exaggerated. It was archival, referencing early-stage capital movement in sectors that had since expanded into institutions she recognized by name, and my name appeared not as headline, but as connective reference, someone who had been present at the formation stage of systems she now assumed were built independently. Jason took the phone then, more forcefully this time, and as he read, I could see the shift in his confidence break into uncertainty, not because of emotion, but because of data that no longer supported his narrative. This does not mean what you think it means, he said, but even he did not sound convinced anymore. Harris finally stepped back slightly, as if his role in the room was nearing completion, and said something that landed differently than everything before it. You have been treating a man with a documented history of strategic financial architecture as though he is dependent on interpretation from those who arrived later. Emily looked at me again then, and this time her voice did not come as quickly. She asked, "Dad, did you ever tell us any of this?" And I could feel the years between that question and my answer, because the truth was not hidden. It was simply never asked for in the language they chose to use when speaking about me. And as I looked around that room, at Jason trying to hold on to control that was already slipping, at Emily trying to reconcile two versions of her father, and at Noah quietly realizing that everything he thought he understood was incomplete, I understood something very clear, that what Harris had revealed was not the full story, only the edge of it, and that the part they had not yet seen was still large enough to change everything they believed about the life they were standing inside. I remember the exact moment the room stopped feeling like it belonged to Jason and started feeling like it was waiting for me instead. Not because I raised my voice, not because I demanded attention, but because I finally stopped treating their confusion as something I needed to fix. Emily was the first to break the silence, her voice shaking slightly as she looked between the documents on the table and my face. "Dad, just tell us what is true," she said, and for the first time that evening, there was no careful filtering in her tone, only uncertainty trying to find solid ground. Jason immediately stepped in, trying to regain control, his words sharper now, less polished. "This is being misinterpreted," he said quickly, turning toward Colonel Harris as if the explanation could be redirected away from me. "You are making assumptions based on outdated filings," but Harris did not respond to him anymore. Instead, he looked at me once, almost as if confirming something he already knew, and then quietly said, "It is your turn now." That sentence changed the air more than anything Jason had said all night, because it implied that there had always been a sequence to this moment, and I had simply not spoken yet. I stood there for a moment, not moving toward anger, not moving toward confrontation, but stepping back internally into something much older than the room we were in. And when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost quiet, and that seemed to unsettle Jason more than any argument could have. "No one in this room has lost control of anything yet," I said, and I saw Jason exhale sharply as if insulted by the absence of panic in my tone. Emily blinked slowly, like she was trying to decide whether I was denying reality or simply redefining it, and Noah took one step closer to the table again, still holding his phone, not speaking, but watching every reaction. Jason laughed once, short and nervous, and said, "You are sitting here acting like there is some hidden empire you control." And I nodded slightly, not agreeing, but acknowledging the misunderstanding. "Not an empire," I said, "a structure you never asked about." Then I turned toward the documents Colonel Harris had placed earlier, and for the first time I allowed myself to speak about them directly, not as secrets, not as mysteries, but as facts that had always existed regardless of whether anyone noticed. "The Whitmore Legacy Trust was never a single account," I said slowly. "It was a networked holding structure, designed for long-term asset protection, not short-term visibility. Jason immediately shook his head, cutting in. That trust belongs to the family. It is under management oversight. But I looked at him directly, and for the first time he stopped speaking mid-sentence. Under whose authorization? I asked, not aggressively, just precisely, and that question did not require volume, only clarity. Emily stepped forward slightly, her voice quieter now, asking, Dad, are you saying Jason cannot access it? And I turned to her, not as a defendant, not as a man under accusation, but as someone explaining something that should have been understood years ago. I am saying access was never absolute. I replied. It was conditional, and conditions have never been met for unilateral control. Jason's expression changed at that moment, not to anger, but to something closer to disbelief that was beginning to fracture into concern. He reached for his phone, scrolling quickly, likely calling or searching for confirmation, and I watched him do it without interruption because interruption would have been unnecessary. Colonel Harris finally spoke again, quietly, almost as if concluding his role. There are recorded fiduciary limitations tied to founder authority designation, he said, and then he added, those limitations do not expire with age or assumption. That was when Jason's composure finally broke in a visible way, not dramatic, but subtle, like a man realizing the rules he had been using were not the only rules that existed. This is ridiculous, he said louder now, pointing slightly toward me. You have been retired for years. You do not even actively manage anything. And I looked at him for a long moment before responding. I do not need to actively manage what was structured to operate without interruption, I said calmly, and that sentence landed differently because it removed emotion entirely from the equation. Emily turned toward Jason now, uncertainty shifting into doubt, and asked quietly, did you ever actually confirm any of this with legal counsel? And Jason hesitated just long enough for her to notice. Noah suddenly spoke again, his voice steadier now. It is not just one article, he said, looking at the screen. There are filings, historical records, and advisory links going back years. And as he spoke, I could see Emily beginning to understand that this was not a single revelation, but a pattern she had never been shown. Jason finally snapped, not in control anymore, saying, even if any of that is true, it does not change current management authority, and that was the moment I realized he still believed authority was something granted by proximity, not structure. I reached for my glass of water, took a slow sip, and when I spoke again, my voice did not rise, because it did not need to. Current management authority is subordinate to founding trust conditions, I said, and I watched Emily's expression shift as she processed those words not emotionally, but structurally. Jason opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, because for the first time, there was nothing immediate left to say that could override what had just been defined. Colonel Harris adjusted his jacket slightly, as if preparing to leave, and said quietly, at this point, this is no longer interpretation, and then he looked at Jason directly. It is verification. The word verification removed the last remaining illusion of debate from the room. Jason looked at Emily, then at Noah, then back at me. And I could see the beginning of something unfamiliar in him, not defeat yet, but the first realization that the narrative he had been relying on was no longer stable. Emily finally sat down slowly, as if her body needed time to accept what her mind had not fully processed, and Noah remained standing, still holding the phone, now no longer searching, just confirming what was already in front of him. And in that quiet, without raising my voice, without demanding anything, without needing anyone to agree, I understood that the balance in that room had already shifted, not because I had taken anything from them, but because the truth they had ignored had finally started speaking in its own language. And for the first time that night, Jason did not look like a man managing a situation, but like a man realizing he had misunderstood the foundation beneath his own feet. I remember the exact moment the room stopped belonging to any single person, not because someone claimed it, but because control itself began to fracture in real time, like glass under pressure that no one is holding but everyone can hear. Jason was the first to show it. Not strength, not authority, but the beginning of collapse disguised as certainty. He paced once near the table, then stopped, looking at Colonel Harris as if trying to find an opening where none existed anymore. This is being blown out of proportion, Jason said, but his voice no longer carried the confidence it had earlier. It carried something thinner, something defensive. Emily looked at him differently now, not with agreement, but with the quiet hesitation of someone recalculating trust in real time. Noah had not moved since he last spoke, still holding his phone, but now he was no longer searching for answers, only watching what answers did to the people around him. Colonel Harris remained still, not intervening, not correcting, just observing like a man who had already seen the outcome and was no longer interested in influencing it. Jason turned suddenly toward Emily, his tone sharper. "You are letting him confuse you," he said, pointing vaguely in my direction. "This is just old financial structure language, nothing more." But Emily did not respond immediately, and that silence hurt Jason more than any argument could have. I stayed seated, hands folded, not because I was passive, but because I had learned long before that systems collapse faster when you stop feeding them resistance. Jason then shifted again, this time toward Harris, trying to regain footing through confrontation. "You are not even part of this family," he said. "You have no standing here." And for the first time, Harris smiled faintly, not in amusement, but in recognition of something predictable. "I do not need standing in your family," he said calmly. "I have standing in the record." That sentence changed something subtle in Jason's posture, because it removed emotion completely from the equation, leaving only structure, documentation, and history. Emily finally spoke again, her voice quieter now. "Jason, just stop," she said, not as an accusation, but as exhaustion, and Jason turned toward her quickly, almost offended by the shift. "You think I did not protect this family," he said. "You think I did not manage what needed to be managed." But even as he said it, the words sounded less like conviction and more like justification being rebuilt mid-collapse. Noah suddenly stepped forward, breaking his silence, and for the first time Jason looked at him, not as a child, but as a variable he could not control. "You said you verified everything," Noah said to Jason, holding his phone up, "but nothing you said matches what I am reading." And Jason immediately tried to dismiss it, reaching out, "Give me that." But Noah pulled it back, not aggressively, just firmly enough to show the shift had already happened. That was the moment the fracture widened. Emily turned fully toward Jason now, her voice trembling slightly. "Did you ever actually ask Grandpa about any of this?" she said. And Jason hesitated, just long enough for the answer to become obvious without being spoken. Colonel Harris stepped forward slightly, not inserting himself, but anchoring the moment, and said quietly, "There is always a point where control stops being assumed and must be proven." And then he looked at Jason directly, "And you have reached that point." Jason laughed once, but it was not real anymore. It was the sound of someone trying to hold onto identity after the structure beneath it has already failed. "You are all acting like this man is some kind of hidden mastermind," Jason said, gesturing toward me. "He is 72 years old, he lives in this house, he is not running anything from behind the scenes." And that was when Emily finally looked at me directly, waiting, not for defense, but for clarity. I did not answer Jason immediately. I looked at Emily instead and said quietly, "You are confusing visibility with control." And the room went still again. But this time it was different, because it was not waiting for Jason anymore. Jason stepped back slightly, as if the ground itself had shifted under his assumptions, and then Noah spoke again, softer this time, almost careful. "It is not just Forbes," he said. "There are references in financial networks, archival investor documentation, and advisory structures tied to multiple entities." And as he said it, Jason finally turned toward him fully, no longer dismissive, but unsettled. "You are a child," Jason said. But even that sounded weak now, because it was not an argument, it was avoidance. Emily shook her head slowly, looking between them, and said, "I do not understand why none of this was ever explained." And that question hung heavier than any accusation, because it revealed the real shift, not financial, but relational. Colonel Harris adjusted his jacket slightly, preparing to leave again, but paused and said one final thing, quieter than everything before it. "The collapse you are witnessing is not caused by new information," he said. "It is caused by old assumptions meeting verified reality." Jason finally stopped speaking after that, not because he was convinced, but because there was nothing left to defend that still held weight. I remained seated, watching them, not intervening, not correcting, not escalating, because I understood something that none of them had reached yet, that I was not the source of their collapse. I was simply the point at which their version of reality stopped matching the truth they had been building around me. Emily slowly sat down again. Her hands pressed together now, no longer confident, no longer certain, only trying to hold on to something stable. Noah looked at me once more, not with confusion anymore, but with recognition that had begun to settle into understanding. Jason stood still, silent now, no longer arguing, no longer explaining, because even he had begun to realize that nothing he could say would restore the structure that had already begun to fall apart on its own. And in that silence, I understood clearly that I had not taken anything from them. I had simply stopped supporting a version of me that had never been true in the first place, and everything else was now adjusting itself accordingly. I remember the exact moment the room stopped feeling like a place where anything needed to be proven anymore, not because something was won, but because something inside me finally stepped away from the need to keep proving it at all. Jason had gone quiet now, not the quiet of reflection, but the quiet of a man whose arguments had nowhere left to land. And Emily was still sitting at the table, her hands folded tightly as if she was trying to hold the shape of a family that had just shifted beyond recognition. Noah remained standing near the chair, his phone now lowered, not because the information was gone, but because he no longer needed it to understand what he was seeing. Colonel Harris looked at me once more, then slowly exhaled, as if acknowledging that his role here had already ended long before anyone else realized it. "You do not need me anymore tonight," he said quietly, and for the first time since he arrived, there was something almost personal in his voice, not duty, not authority, but closure. I nodded slightly, not because I was dismissing him, but because I understood what he meant. Jason finally spoke again, but his voice was different now, reduced, stripped of structure. "This is not over," he said, but even he did not sound convinced by the sentence as it left him, and Emily immediately responded without looking at him. "It already is," she said softly, and that was the first time she had spoken against him without hesitation. There was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion, the kind that comes when belief collapses faster than emotion can rebuild it. I stood slowly, not with ceremony, not with dominance, but with a quiet physical awareness that the weight I had been carrying in that room was no longer mine to hold. Jason watched me as I moved, and for the first time there was no accusation in his expression, only uncertainty trying to replace control. "Where are you going?" Emily asked, and her voice carried something fragile now, not fear of me, but fear of what distance meant when truth no longer matched memory. I looked at her for a long moment before answering, and when I did, my voice was calm, almost gentle. "I am not leaving you," I said. "I am leaving what this has become." That distinction mattered more than any explanation I could have given. Noah stepped slightly closer to me, and I could see in his face something that had not been there before that night, not curiosity anymore, but understanding shaped by discomfort rather than assumption. Jason tried one last time to reframe everything, saying something about legal review, about misinterpretation, about needing time to verify, but even as he spoke, his words no longer reached anyone the same way. Emily finally turned fully toward him and said, "Stop," not loudly, not harshly, but with a finality that did not require repetition. And in that moment, I realized something important, that collapse does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with people simply no longer agreeing to participate in the version that no longer feels true. I walked toward the hallway slowly, passing the place where photographs once defined the idea of family in simpler terms, and I noticed how quiet the house had become, not empty, but recalibrated. Noah followed me a few steps, then stopped, unsure whether he was leaving or staying, and I placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Do not try to fix what you just saw," I said quietly. "Just understand it." He nodded once, and that was enough. Behind me, I could hear Emily speaking to Jason in a low voice, not arguing anymore, but asking questions that no longer had rehearsed answers. Jason responded, but the certainty was gone from his tone, replaced by something more vulnerable, something closer to fear of losing definition than fear of losing control. When I reached the front door, I paused, not because I was uncertain, but because I could feel the difference between leaving in defeat and leaving in clarity, and I chose neither. I simply stepped outside into the night air of Fairfax, Virginia, where the temperature felt honest in a way the house no longer was. The world outside did not demand explanation. It did not ask for verification. It simply existed, steady and unchanged by the decisions made behind closed doors. I stood there for a moment, breathing, not as a man trying to escape conflict, but as someone who had finally stopped living inside it. And in that silence, I realized that peace was not something that arrived after resolution. It was something that appeared when I stopped mistaking chaos for belonging, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like I was returning to anything at all. I simply felt like I was still here. I remember the morning after everything changed, not because the world felt different at first glance, but because the silence in the house in Fairfax, Virginia, no longer carried tension, only clarity, as if the air itself had finally stopped pretending. Jason was no longer in the house when I came down the stairs, and no one announced his absence. It simply existed, like something the structure of the home had quietly removed overnight. Emily was in the kitchen, standing near the sink with a coffee cup she was not drinking, her posture smaller than I had ever seen it. Not defeated, but reorganizing itself around something painful and honest. Noah sat at the table scrolling slowly, not searching anymore, just confirming details he already understood. And when he looked up at me, there was no confusion left in his eyes, only a quiet kind of maturity that does not belong to age, but to awareness. Emily finally spoke first, her voice low, careful. "Dad." Jason went to stay with his brother, and she stopped there, as if the rest of the sentence did not need to exist for it to be understood. I nodded once, not because I approved or disapproved, but because I understood something simpler, that systems collapse in silence long before people acknowledge it. There were legal calls that morning, brief, procedural, confirming what Colonel Harris had already made clear the night before, that certain structures tied to the Whitmore legacy were not subject to unilateral control, not because of conflict, but because of design. I did not celebrate it. I did not even dwell on it, because what mattered was not who had lost authority, but what kind of life remained once the illusion of control was gone. Emily sat across from me later that day, finally speaking without hesitation, telling me she had not understood how much she had been carrying without realizing it was not hers to carry. And I listened without interrupting, because sometimes understanding does not need correction, it only needs space. Noah asked me if I had known all along what the financial structure meant, and I told him the truth, that I had known enough to remain quiet, but not enough to prevent people from misunderstanding what quiet meant. There was no anger in the house anymore, not even regret at first, only the slow return of individuality, like people remembering they had existed before they became roles inside someone else's expectations. Days passed like that, not dramatically, but steadily, and I began to see something I had not seen in years. Emily started making decisions without looking over her shoulder, and Noah started asking questions not to challenge authority, but to understand it. One evening, Emily brought out an old photograph of Margaret, placing it on the table between us, and for a long time none of us spoke. Because some memories do not need explanation to feel present. "I think she would have hated what we became," Emily said softly, and I replied, not with judgment, but with honesty, "I think she would have understood how easily it happened." Jason's absence became a fact of life rather than a topic, not because anyone erased him, but because what he represented no longer shaped the decisions in the room. And over time, even that stopped feeling important. Colonel Harris called once, briefly, not to discuss outcomes, but to confirm that everything had settled into its correct legal form. And before he hung up, he said something I did not forget. People think truth changes lives quickly, but most of the time it just restores them slowly. In the weeks that followed, I found myself sitting outside more often, not thinking about what had happened, but noticing what had always been there, the quiet rhythm of a life no longer defined by defense. Emily began rebuilding her understanding of me, not as a version she had inherited, but as a person she was finally meeting, and Noah, in his own way, started to see me less as a mystery and more as a man who had simply lived long enough to be misread. One afternoon, Noah asked me directly, "Do you feel like you won?" And I remember thinking about that question longer than I expected, because it assumed something I no longer believed in. "I do not think that is the right word." I told him, "I think I just stopped losing myself." And that felt more accurate than any victory language ever could. Emily and I began talking more honestly, not about the past, but about boundaries, trust, and what it means to let someone else define your value without realizing it is happening. And I saw in her something I had not seen before, the beginning of self-respect returning after a long absence. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no perfect ending, only the quiet recognition that some relationships survive not because they are repaired, but because they are finally seen clearly. One evening, I held Margaret's old watch in my hand, the one I had kept on the shelf for years without wearing, and I realized I no longer needed it to remember her, because remembering no longer hurt in the same way. It simply grounded me. I told Emily and Noah that families do not break in a single moment, and they do not heal in one either. They adjust when truth is no longer negotiable, and silence is no longer mistaken for agreement. If there is anything I would want anyone listening to understand, it is that being underestimated often feels like being erased, but it is not the same thing, and what others fail to see does not determine what you are. If this story reached you in a place you do not often speak about, I want you to know you are not alone in that silence. Many people carry versions of themselves that were never fully seen and still learn how to stand without them. Take a moment, if it feels right, to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts, not out of obligation, but because stories like this are never really about one person, they are about recognition. And if you are watching this from somewhere in the world, I would genuinely like to know where you are and what time it is for you right now, because connection sometimes begins in the smallest details. The lesson I carry from all of this is simple, but it took me most of a lifetime to understand it. That self-worth is not given by proximity. It is protected by awareness, and no family structure, no financial structure, and no expectation has the right to replace that. And if there is one thing I hope stays with you after this, it comes from no longer needing to be defined by them. If you would like to hear more stories about family, truth, and the quiet moments where people reclaim themselves, there are more waiting in the playlist on this channel, each one carrying a different version of the same lesson in its own way, and perhaps one of them will meet you exactly where you are right now. Thank you for listening to this story.